Thank you all for coming today. We have a distinguished witness. Hugh Griffiths is the outgoing coordinator of the UN panel of experts on North Korea, which just released its biannual report on the impact of sanctions against North Korea. Before discussing the UN report, we ought to review where we stand with North Korea. The Trump administration expressed optimism going into the Hanoi summit, but Kim Jong-un demanded the lifting of the all-important UN Security Council economic sanctions. In return, he did not offer complete, verifiable denuclearization. He did not even offer a termination of the creation of new fissile material and new nuclear bombs. He did not. He offered only to dismantle the facilities at Yongbyon. North Korea has other known and perhaps unknown facilities to create fissile material, not to mention facilities where warheads are constructed and missiles are developed. After hearing this proposal, President Trump rejected it, and for perhaps the first time in my career, I made the statement, Donald Trump is right.
For you, you're growing.
When President Trump and I, where we apparently disagree is where we go from here. I believe that North Korea has conclusively demonstrated that it is not under enough pressure to agree to a deal acceptable to the United States. Now, just about everyone in and around government of the United States says that we should be demanding complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. That would leave North Korea with no nuclear weapons of any sort, and that is a regime that is paranoid and, given some discussions in Washington from time to time, perhaps justifiably paranoid. I think that we should be willing to accept a highly intrusive verification system that would assure us that North Korea was not making any more weapons, had a limited number of weapons, and was not selling any fissile material. But whether your objective is a highly monitored and very limited nuclear North Korea, or whether it is complete denuclearization, neither was available to us in Hanoi. I think that if you want a better outcome, you need better sanctions. The Trump administration announced some additional sanctions. Then we learned the president had withdrawn them. Now it appears that the president has withdrawn his withdrawal. There was discussion that his withdrawal was not of the new sanctions, but of additional sanctions that had not been announced. I don't know if our distinguished witness can shed some light on this, but the fact is that even the new sanctions, if allowed to go in effect, will not be significant enough to get Chairman Kim to change his bargaining position. I'm hopeful our witness today can help us understand what more intense sanctions against North Korea would look like, and it may be the case that new sanctions are needed. It may be the case that we need more effective implementation of existing sanctions. The latest report of the UN panel of experts on North Korea has said that existing UN Security Council sanctions against the Kim regime are ineffective. The report specifically singled out the financial sanctions, writing, "Financial sanctions remain some of the most poorly implemented and actively evaded measures of the sanctions regime." It is noted that North Korea continues to have access to international financial system through 5 countries. The most notably of those, of course, is China. We know about 90% of North Korea's trade is with China, so getting Beijing to implement sanctions against Kim Jong-un remains key to our efforts. Now, the Trump focusing on both financial sanctions and financial sanctions and China, the Trump administration did impose sanctions on one small Chinese bank in July of 2017. If it wasn't already clear, the latest report confirms that sanctioning this small bank did not deter China from continuing to serve as North Korea's financial lifeline. Both in 2017 and again in 2018, then Chairman and then Ranking Yoho and then Ranking Member Sherman wrote the administration demanding that impose sanctions on one of the 4 large Chinese banks that continue to do business with North Korea. And I think that events have shown that this action is increasingly needed. So with that, I'll turn it over to our Ranking Member, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your words. Mr. Griffiths, thank you for being here to educate us on this process and on the summary of the report. I would like to welcome Mr. Hugh Griffiths, Coordinator for the United Nations Panel of Experts on North Korea. Mr. Griffiths has had firsthand experience monitoring and implementing the implementation of the North Korean sanctions resolutions passed by the United Nations Security Council, 15 members. As a body that plays a leading role in crafting the U.S. sanctions regime, his insight is invaluable to this committee. The United Nations has imposed 10 sanctions resolutions that require its member states to restrict trade and engagement with North Korea in response to North Korea's relentless development of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. However, the panel of experts' last report released this month shows that North Korea continues to defy these sanctions. Possibly the most egregious violation revealed in the report is a massive increase in ship-to-ship transfer of petroleum and coal. This type of industrial-scale activity can significantly undercut international sanctions programs, as was pointed out by the report. But the report also reaffirms that North Korea is up to its old tricks as well. North Korea's sanctions evasions are made possible through weak enforcement by individual states and insufficient oversight measures. But there's also the usual rogue galleries of pariah states that blatantly ignore UN sanctions. They're glad to pursue trade and defense relations with North Korea. As the United States continues to navigate our diplomacy with North Korea and address the growing threat North Korea poses globally, it is imperative that the multilateral sanctions program overseen by the panel of experts remains strong. You know, look, this problem's been going on since the end of the Korean conflict. This is something that we've seen an escalation of the development of nuclear weapons. And as you can tell here, the size of this room, the importance of this discussion. You know, how long are we going to let this go on? And I said that the UN Security Council voted unanimously. There was 15 members in that, beyond the 5 permanent members. They voted unanimously to put sanctions on North Korea. And I see things pretty black and white. If we vote to do that, well, by God, we ought to follow through and make sure everybody on the Security Council that voted this way adheres to that. So I'm especially interested today to hear an update on the status of the UN sanction enforcement, how we can improve implementation, and where the international community may be falling short, especially regarding longstanding sanction violators, including China and Russia, who have long provided life support to North Korea's WMD programs and their weapons programs, their chemical weapons in addition to nuclear. 90 to 94% of the trade with North Korea goes through China. China has a significant role to play in this, and if they voted to uphold these sanctions, and yet they're one of the biggest cheaters, it raises the question, why bother having UN Security Council resolutions? Or why bother having members that are on a permanent committee for the United Nations Security Council vote to put in sanctions, and then they pull away and they don't enforce these sanctions? So I guess the question is, why do we bother even doing this if we're not going to adhere to it? But since we're here, what do we do with these nation states that vote to put sanctions on and then they break their commitment? Should we censor them so that they can't vote for a period of time, maybe a year or 2 years? Or should we look at removing them permanently because their actions don't define the reason that they're on the Security Council in the first place. And I look forward to your testimony and the questions that follow. Thank you.
It's our usual practice to welcome opening statements from other members of the subcommittee of 1 minute, but Mr. Conley has asked for a longer period of time. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the distinguished chairman and I thank the ranking member for holding this important hearing today. I serve as the chairman of the Korea Caucus and also head of the congressional delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Following the failed Hanoi summit between President Trump and Mr. Kim, we're not even close to the goal of a denuclearized North Korea. On the contrary, the DPRK reportedly continues to produce fissile material for weapons and to work on more advanced long-range missiles. According to the 2019 Worldwide Threat Assessment, the U.S. intelligence community finds that North Korea will seek to retain its weapons of mass destruction capability and is unlikely to completely give up its nuclear weapons and production capability. The latest POE report stated that North Korea's nuclear and missile programs remain intact and found that North Korea has been using civilian facilities and infrastructure to assemble and test missiles. In November of last year, I presented a white paper to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly on North Korea's challenge to international security and the implications for NATO itself. My report noted the extensive sanctions evasion carried out by North Korea and documented by the POE. It also made several recommendations regarding actions NATO and NATO member states could take to combat sanctions evasion, including the adoption of comprehensive restrictions in maritime insurance for DPRK vessels and vessels engaged in trade with the DPRK. I think maritime insurance is something that's been overlooked and could be a very potent tool in enforcing the sanctions Mr. Yoho just talked about. The world must remain clear-eyed about the DPRK's record of violating previous nuclear agreements and stands ready to continue the campaign to isolate Pyongyang in the absence of verifiable progress toward denuclearization and the ceasing of other destabilizing behavior. The United States should lead the international community through the enforcement and expansion of the DPRK sanctions regime, as well as increased maritime interdiction efforts to counter the regime's sanctions evasion efforts. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Griffith's testimony this morning. I think this remains a front burner issue, and we, as I said, I think we need to be very clear-eyed about the intentions of the North Korean regime. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your consideration.
Thank you. Are there other members seeking to make an opening statement? Let's hear from our witness. Mr. Griffiths.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ranking members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify today. I've been asked to present on the UN Panel of Experts 2019 final report that was published earlier this month. I believe that this document serves as a useful basis for any discussion entitled "How to Make UN Sanctions More Effective, the Case of North Korea." Before this discussion, I would like to pay tribute to the hard-working and dedicated UN experts and UN Secretariat staff who work on the other panels, groups, and monitoring teams in New York, but also those working in or from Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. My colleagues deploy to or are based in difficult and dangerous parts of the world. These include Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, Mali, Somalia, South Sudan, the Sudan, Libya, and Yemen, as well as visits to neighboring member states. The experts come from a variety of backgrounds: law enforcement, customs, humanitarian aid, former diplomats, former members of the armed forces, defense, and intelligence services. They also include field researchers, academics, journalists, and former UN staff. Their reports provide the gold standard for national and international policymakers working on complex conflicts that include a UN sanctions regime. My colleagues investigate the groups, individuals, and sometimes member states that are responsible for violating the various Security Council resolutions. Their mandates include investigating arms embargo violations, monitoring and reporting on armed groups, transnational criminal organizations, various Al-Qaeda or ISIL affiliates, the Taliban, as well as other individuals or entities that engage in the smuggling of arms and other conflict-sensitive commodities, such as diamonds. My colleagues seek to identify those to be recommended for assets freezes and travel bans to the UN Security Council. As such, the UN panels and groups of experts have been deliberately targeted by their adversaries in the past, and sometimes this goes beyond surveillance and threats. I therefore dedicate this testimony to the memory of Michael Sharp and Zaida Catalan of the UN group of experts monitoring the sanctions in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who were murdered in the Kasai region in March 2017. Michael was from the United States of America. Zaida was from Sweden and Chile. More than 2 years have passed, and no one has yet been convicted for these serious crimes. Their sacrifice is a reminder of the dangers my friends and colleagues face in the field, and we honor their memory. Turning to the sanctions on North Korea, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, as it is known in UN documents, I should stress that these sanctions are amongst the most comprehensive but also targeted measures applied as part of any UN sanctions regime. The situation now is very different to that of my last testimony before Congress in 2013. The UN sanctions regime has been transformed by the 5 UN Security Council resolutions adopted in response to the DPRK's 3 illegal nuclear tests in 2016 and 2017, as well as an unprecedented number of prohibited ballistic missile tests during the same period. The UN sanctions regime underwent a fundamental step change beginning with Resolution 2270/2016, adopted by the Security Council on 2nd March 2016. This was in response to the DPRK's 4th nuclear test in January 2016 and a prohibited rocket launch of February 2017 that used ballistic missile technology. Until the 2nd of March 2016, the UN sanctions regime on the DPRK had been a classic non-proliferation regime, prohibiting the acquisition by the DPRK of nuclear and ballistic missile technology that would enable it to further develop its illegal nuclear and ballistic weapons program. There was also an arms embargo prohibiting the DPRK from exporting or importing conventional arms and related military equipment. The 4th nuclear test in January and the rocket launch of February 2016 led the Security Council to widen the sanctions regime to include the inspection by member states of all cargo on their territory originating from, transiting, or destined for the DPRK. Key DPRK export commodities such as coal, iron, and iron ore were prohibited for the first time unless these exports were determined to be solely for livelihood purposes and unrelated to generating foreign currency revenue for the DPRK's nuclear or ballistic missile programs, or other activities prohibited by the resolutions. These commodities were mainly transported by ship, and Resolution 2270 contained other new and important maritime prohibitions, including a ban on approximately 30 North Korean ships that would preclude these vessels from entering any foreign port. North Korea ignored the Security Council's decisions regarding its ballistic missile programs and continued tests of various types during the remainder of 2016, as well as a nuclear test in September of that year. In response to these prohibited activities, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2321 on 30th of November. This included additional or expanded maritime and commodity sanctions, including a cap on coal exports and a ban on the export by the DPRK of copper, nickel, silver, and zinc, among other measures. However, during the first half of 2017, the DPRK continued its illegal ballistic missile tests. The Security Council then adopted another resolution, 2356, that designated 14 North Korean individuals. But North Korea continued to disobey the Security Council by conducting its first successful test of an intercontinental ballistic missile on the 4th of July. In response, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2371 on 5th September, which completely prohibited the export of coal, iron ore, lead ore, and seafood. It expanded the financial sanctions on the DPRK and banned the chartering of North Korean ships by foreign companies. North Korea had already disobeyed that resolution and its predecessors by exploding its largest nuclear device to date on 3rd September. In response, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2375. This resolution introduced an annual cap on petroleum imported to the DPRK annually of 2 million barrels. It also set a cap on crude oil. A ban was placed on condensates, natural gas imports, and textile exports from the DPRK. Joint ventures and cooperative entities with DPRK nationals and entities were also prohibited. Maritime interdiction measures on DPRK-related vessels were introduced. Further work authorizations for DPRK nationals on the territory of member states were also prohibited, with a number of limited exemptions. On 15th September, the DPRK launched another ICBM, and on the 28th November, the DPRK launched yet another ICBM, its largest to date, the Hwasong-15. In response to these launches, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2397. This resolution increased by fourfold the annual cap on petroleum products, reducing to 500,000 barrels per year that might be legally imported. In that resolution, the Security Council also decided that should the DPRK conduct any further nuclear or ballistic missile tests, imports would be further reduced. The resolution also explicitly acknowledged that, quote, the proceeds of the DPRK's trade in sectoral goods, including, but not limited to coal, iron ore, lead ore, textiles, seafood, gold, silver, rare earth minerals, and other prohibited metals, as well as the revenue generated from DPRK workers overseas, among others, contribute to the DPRK's nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. Resolution 2397 expanded sectoral sanctions by introducing a ban on the DPRK's export of food and agricultural products, machinery, electrical equipment, earth and stone, including magnesite, magnesia, wood, and vessels. The resolution also prohibited the DPRK from selling or transferring fishing rights. The resolution also introduced a ban on some very important imports, including the supply, sale, or transfer to the DPRK of all industrial machinery, transportation vehicles, iron, steel, and other metals, with the exception of spare parts to maintain North Korean commercial civilian aircraft. 2397 also strengthened the ban on providing work authorizations for DPRK nationals by requiring member states to repatriate all such nationals earning income abroad within their jurisdiction within 24 months from 22nd December 2017. The above is a summarized version of events. However, the pattern is clear. An illegal nuclear test or serious ballistic missile launch is met with a response from the Security Council in the form of additional sanctions. I stress again, by Resolution 2397, adopted on 22nd December 2017, the Security Council decided that further such illegal tests or launches would result in further caps on North Korea's petroleum imports. Since 22nd December 2017, there have been no further nuclear tests or serious ballistic missile launches. Now turning to the issue of how North Korea is evading the current sanctions regime, I would like to focus on the executive summary of the panel's final report, which provides information on this subject. The nuclear and ballistic missiles programs of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea remain intact, and the country continues to defy Security Council resolutions through a massive increase in illegal ship-to-ship transfers of petroleum products and coal. These violations render the latest UN security sanctions ineffective by flouting the caps on the import of petroleum products and crude oil by the DPRK, as well as the coal ban imposed in 2017 by the Security Council in response.
Mr. Griffith, how much longer is your opening statement? Our usual practice is 5 minutes as an opening statement. I'm told that we arranged for your opening statement to be 10 minutes. About how much longer do you have?
Well, sir, I'm guessing another 6, 7 minutes.
There are many panels where the opening statements are that long. I wonder if you could summarize your remarks and then respond to questions, and of course your entire statement would be made part of the record. I realize you've come a way to make this presentation, but the traditions of the Foreign Affairs Committee are for 5-minute opening statements.
Well, sir, it's your venue. I'll bow to your traditions, but I'll just stress that the report is quite long and the subject is complex. So I'm happy to stop here and take your questions.
If there's a way for you to give us the high points in another 2 minutes or so, that would be fine.
Well, I tell you what, I'll just conclude by, in conclusion, I should stress that the report also noted the DPRK's use of civilian infrastructure for ballistic missile assembly and testing. From previous panel reports, one may observe that the DPRK has made widespread use of ostensibly civilian, commercial, diplomatic, and trade entities and personnel for past ballistic missile and nuclear-related procurement from other member states. There are also many examples of the use of the DPRK's merchant fleet of vessels, DPRK diplomats, trade representatives, and embassies for arms sales, illegal financial transactions, and other activities prohibited under the resolutions. I believe the Security Council imposed so many measures on North Korea through UN sanctions, at least 26 measures, compared to the average of 3.5 for a UN sanctions regime on the DPRK for the above reasons, for the use of civilian infrastructure, for the use of diplomats, for the use of embassies. These comprehensive and targeted measures, particularly beginning in March 2016, were in response to the DPRK's single-minded pursuit of its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs, for which all the resources of the state, civilian, diplomatic, and military, were deployed as necessary. I would like to conclude this written testimony by recognizing the hard work and dedication of my panel colleagues, past, present, and future. I would also like to thank UN Secretariat colleagues, without whom our investigations and reports would not have been possible. My former and current panel members and UN staff colleagues have made our reporting something to be rightly proud of, and I would like to thank them for their service. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Griffiths. I know that you didn't have a chance to deliver your entire opening statement, and that's why I'll give you time at the end of these hearings to give us a concluding statement to include any of the material that was not elicited by questions. At this point, I need to leave for just a few minutes. I'm going to recognize Mr. Conley for 5 minutes, and then he will recognize Mr. Yoho for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair. Before I begin, Mr. Griffiths, on behalf of all of us, we want to honor your two lost colleagues in the service of international peace, and we're so sorry for that loss, and we, like you, hope the perpetrators of those grisly murders will be brought to justice. Thank you for your testimony this morning. You know, one of the concerns I always have about raising expectations too high is that results are often disappointing. And maybe with the best of intentions, President Trump agreed in an unprecedented move to meet with the leader of North Korea, first president ever to do that. He not only met with him in Singapore, he met with him again in Hanoi. Expectations were high. The South Korean president was overjoyed at the prospect of perhaps reconciliation measures in the peninsula and the dismantlement of the nuclear program in North Korea. Since those two summits, however, the status of the nuclear development program, as your testimony indicates, and as the report of the POE indicates, seems not to have changed at all. Overt testing of missiles has ceased, but in terms of proceeding with the nuclear development program, the evidence would suggest we're going in the wrong direction. Have I got that wrong? I mean, have we had concrete steps toward denuclearization in your expert opinion?
Well, so the resolutions remain in force, and my expertise is investigating North Korean evasion of the sanctions measures.
Yes, but Mr. Griffiths, the purpose of the sanctions is to deter the nuclear development program in North Korea. Is it not?
The resolutions talk about the need for dialogue within the six-party talks, and within that framework, the resolutions talk about verifiable denuclearization.
Right. And have you seen progress since the two summits or since the adoption of those resolutions in terms of verifiable measures toward denuclearization?
No, sir, I have not.
We talked about sanction evasion, and you talked about 26 measures imposed by the United Nations at least, and you described those 26 as being comprehensive. I mentioned in my testimony, and you shook your head yes, I think, but what about maritime insurance? Is there a way we can use maritime insurance to deter offshore offloading of illegal goods that evade sanctions? Can we do a better job of that among both UN members and, as I advocated, NATO members?
Yes, sir. I think addressing maritime insurance as part of a comprehensive approach that looks at flag states in particular, but also vessel owners, vessel operators, commodity traders, the oil companies that contract with vessels, whose product is sometimes diverted to North Korean tankers for these illegal ship-to-ship transfers. If you look at the whole maritime ecosystem in that part of the world and target every international actor involved, you will see good results.
How widespread, well, how satisfied are you, in terms of cooperation among UN members with POE and with what you're trying to do in the enforcement of sanctions? Is it widespread, the evasion, or is it kind of limited to a select number?
It's a difficult question to give us a short answer to. If we focus on the North Koreans, because the North Koreans have approached sanctions evasion in a very, very intelligent manner. And they look at the global system, the global financial system, how the maritime ecosystem works in practice, and they look for the gaps. They look for the gaps in banking security. That's how they conduct these massive heists, $81 million in the case of Bank of Bangladesh. So they are sophisticated, and you only have to look at the cartels, the narco traffickers, to see how they evade law enforcement mechanisms to conduct their trade so successfully. And I would say that the North Korean masterminds behind their illegal activities approach it in the same way. They bank with respectable banks one way or another. They use loopholes, particularly in the offshore economy and international financial centers, to get round security measures that are in place. So that's where I would start from.
Thank you. My time is up. I am going to give you a copy of the paper I referenced that was presented to the annual meeting of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which is the latest, sort of the legislative arm of NATO. And the reason I'm giving it to you is even though North Korea is not sort of an issue directly related to European collective security or North Atlantic collective security, we decided that it is an issue we have to address. And this paper was adopted unanimously. And so, a lot of the work in this paper relied on the work you did at POE. So thank you for your work, and it continues to reverberate in lots of other forums. Chair now recognizes my friend, the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I appreciate your testimony. And, you know, first I want to just reiterate what Mr. Connolly said about your colleagues, Michael Sharp and Zaid Catalan, giving up their life for monitoring sanctions. You know, they are out there doing that inspections of what the UN and the people that vote that way task them to do. And so they've given up their life, and I know that was an emotional time for you, and I appreciate you dedicating this to them. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we move forward. Sanctions are in place. The UN, and we just met with the Secretary General, I think it was a week or 2 weeks ago, and we talked about when sanctions are put in place and member nations or member states, they don't adhere to them. What can we do to those? Because this is a serious issue in North Korea. It's been going on, it's been escalating. They've perfected from intermediate to long-range missiles, God knows what else, and we know they have nuclear weapons. Left unchecked another 5 or 10 years, I'm sure we'd all agree it would be worse situation, you know, and it would be that much stronger. When I look at North Korea, I see the epitome of the black market, the epitome of the underground market, or the dark web. They have learned how to navigate in a 21st century world without being present. They can funnel money through different shell corporations, whether it's in Hong Kong, Singapore, even the United States, and they become very astute at doing that. As you brought up, the $81 million. I don't think we can ever block all of that, but when I have a country, i.e. China, that does over 90% of the trade with North Korea, that is a member of the Permanent Security Council, and Russia, that are evading the sanctions, you know, we can go after the $81 million, but I think we need to go after the bigger players. What is, in your recommendation, I know it's got to be frustrating, UN votes on it, on the sanctions, you guys have to monitor it, then you have to report back, and countries like Russia, or all the 15 countries that were on that unanimous decision, they can weigh in on this, on your report, right? And they can kind of redact things, is that true?
No, sir.
They can't redact it?
No, sir.
Can they can challenge stuff in there, right?
There was one occasion where a member state made public some form of displeasure. I mean, people have conversations with me all the time, but no member state has ever redacted a panel.
Thank you for clarifying
panel
that.
report. I mean, annexes have been routinely in the past made confidential, but everything has been published that the panel has wanted to publish.
So your 378-page report is peer
Peer
information.
reviewed.
Well, it's peer information that your panel, the POE, has come out with, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. That's good to know, because I was told earlier that it gets redacted by, certain nation states. So I need to review that.
Well, the only people who've talked to me about redactions are panel members.
Okay.
And we certainly haven't agreed to any redactions of the report by member states. That
I
would,
look forward to going through that.
that would be wrong.
What would be your recommendation on countries that don't adhere? Well, let's just focus on the 5 permanent member states on the NSC, National Security Council. What would be a recommendation for countries that vote to put sanctions and then don't adhere to them? Do you have any recommendations?
Well, sir, I mean, to be frank with you, on the subjects that we have tackled within our 2019 final report, it's more a case of individuals and companies seeking to make money from sanctions evasion by
Sure.
cooperating with the North Koreans. In absolute honesty, there are only a few sanctions violations by the North Koreans in certain African and Middle Eastern states, which were providing either ballistic missile or conventional arms technology or services, whereby the senior leadership of the Ministry of Defense of that country, and thereby the Office of the President or State Security, would have been aware of what these North Koreans were doing there.
Well, let me ask you about the ship-to-ship transfers that happens with China, because China, the controlling, the ultimate entity there is the Chinese Communist Party. So I can't imagine shipping entities under so-called private registration are allowed to do ship-to-ship transfers without the Chinese Communist Party. So therefore, it would indicate a nation state being complicit. Am I wrong on that?
Well, here's the technical thing, sir, and it's actually a really important point. I mean, you might have access to different and higher levels of intelligence. I'm not read into, I don't have U.S. security clearance. But if you look at even a U.S. document, and it's a very useful document, it was issued on March 21st, and it's from the U.S. Department of Treasury, together with their colleagues in the State Department and the Coast Guard, and it's called Updated Guidance on Addressing North Korea's Illicit Shipping Practices. And that's a really important document that's become kind of lost in all this, I suppose, media focus on the recent sanctions cases, your country's sanctions cases, the 2 companies. But if you look at this document, the Treasury guidance, and at the back, you will see which vessels that the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. government, believe have engaged in ship-to-ship transfers with North Korean tankers.
Great.
And while many of the flag states, and it's important because the flag states have the jurisdiction over the vessels, no matter who's crewing them, no matter where the companies are. I'll read you them. This is a U.S. document.
For brevity of time here and to get to the
Togo,
members.
Sierra Leone, Panama, Togo, Republic of Korea, unknown, Panama, unknown, Singapore, unknown, Togo, Russia, Sierra Leone, Russia, unknown. I mean, the list goes on. This is just U.S. information. It's not UN-approved information.
What I would like to do is, with the chairman's permission, is have that entered into the record, and we're going to get a copy of that, and we'll look at that, and then we'll follow through on the recommendations we've already heard. I thought Mr. Connolly's idea of looking at the insurance companies is a great way to do this, and we look forward to working together in a bipartisan manner.
Thank you.
With that, I yield back, and thank you.
We now have the most comprehensive sanctions on North Korea that we've ever had, but the ones we used to have were not effective, and the ones we have now are not effective enough to get the North Koreans to take a fair bargaining position. Sanctions are hard because those governments that deserve to be sanctioned are the very governments that don't care if you reduce their GDP by 5 percentage points. Any administration that hurt our economy for anything but the best possible reasons would be voted out of office. That is not a risk that Chairman Kim faces. This body has, and I mean the Foreign Affairs Committee, has been troubled by the administration's lack of transparency to Congress and withholding information on the diplomatic negotiation process with Pyongyang and intelligence related to the North Korea's weapon systems. Have you and the panel encountered challenges in working with the State Department in getting information for your report draft?
Well, the main thing for the panel is we operate to a very high standard of evidence, and you will see that in the report. We try and make everything court admissible. Everybody on the panel knows who our sources are, even if we don't say publicly. So we would be very appreciative of more imagery on ship-to-ship transfers from everyone. And you can see in the report that we haven't had imagery for quite a long time on ship-to-ship transfers, or it's been quite limited. And the imagery is the most important thing. Ships are big. If you get the images, then you can drill down. Then you can find out the brokers involved, their bank accounts, trace back to the North Korean brokers. So it's critical to get the ship-to-ship imagery as the starting point, and then you can take that to the flag states, all these flags of convenience who don't monitor the very ships that sail under their jurisdiction and hold them to account. Unfortunately, the panel doesn't have the kind of assets that allow us to get close-up imagery of these ship-to-ship transfers.
Has the United States and the State Department given you many images over the last year or two?
Well, I'm an investigator, so I'd always like more. We could certainly do with more. There are a whole range of member
We
states.
will do whatever we can to
That would be
hold
good.
the
Thank you.
State Department accountable for its decision not to give you more. Since this report, the whole purpose is sanctions implementation, and the United Nations is critical to that. There are a number, at least one African state, that have North Korean security personnel that seem to be one of the things that the North Korean government exports is cadres of thugs, armed men, whatever. Which states are those operating in now?
Well, in our latest report, the panel noted issues arising from Angola, not Angola, my apologies, Angola are in the clear right now, Uganda.
Yeah, I believe that was featured in the Wall Street Journal.
Yes, sir. There's some troubling things going on there. On finance, we have real concerns about Libya. There were attempted sales to Libya through a Syrian intermediary named Hussein al-Ali, who was working on behalf of the North Koreans. We've had no answers back from the Libyan authorities on this either. We hear troubling rumors about Namibia once again. We've had no response from Tanzania on a variety of military activities, military services that North Korea certainly was providing.
If you could bring to the attention of the committee those countries where you've asked a specific question and not gotten an answer, we can amplify your request and inquire of their ambassador here as to why this UN request for information has not been granted. So I would ask you to furnish for the record a list of specific unanswered questions and who you asked them to, and can't guarantee anything, but we can certainly push people to answer those questions that are still relevant. So please just provide those, those questions that you've asked that are relevant to your operation and have not been answered. China has 4 of the largest banks in the world by assets: the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, the China Construction Bank, and the Agricultural Bank of China, and simply the Bank of China. So those are the big 4 in China. Have any of these 4 directly or indirectly through front companies or directly helped facilitate North Korea's access to the international financial system?
Well, in our report, we talk about global banks. And that's, big banks, but it doesn't matter their nationality, actually. If you drill down.
Do you name the particular global banks that are assisting North Korea?
Well, it's more complicated than that because we find that they are unwitting. I mean, we don't have the kind of
unwitting but negligent, or unwitting and deceived by such brilliant deception that we can't blame them for being deceived?
In one case I was dealing with, I think they can put measures in. We recommend in our recommendations, which are in my testimony, at least for ship-to-ship transfers, that global banks can easily insert a clause, which is basically a box tick, that will force all the oil companies, all the global commodity trading companies who are leveraged with loans and financial credit instruments to buy and sell the fuel. The banks can introduce something to force their clients to undertake more measures. So that's
do you have the proposed language that should be in the contract?
We don't go that far because the.
Well, I would ask you to supplement the record. Say, when we say we want this, this is what we want, because this Congress could pass a law saying no bank can do business in the United States unless they put this in all their contracts. That would be an effective way to get it in all the contracts. Let's see. There's been changes. It's one thing to announce sanctions. They're documents on a piece of paper and lawyers can read the fine print. But business people respond not only to the fine print, but the atmospherics. That's the fine print. Is it going to be enforced, or are they just joking? Is it going to be enforced, and tomorrow there's going to be even stricter sanctions, so why plan a business deal today that is even legal because tomorrow it'll be illegal, versus, well, that's the sanction that exists today, it's time to plan a business deal because they'll be waiving that sanction tomorrow. Has the Donald Trump rapprochement with Kim Jong-un as an individual, going from Rocket Man or Little Rocket Man to I think the word love was used, a love letter or something. Has that change in atmospherics changed the attitude of China, Russia, and the big shipping companies to whether they really have to abide by the sanctions?
So love letters aren't subject to sanctions, and therefore the panel doesn't investigate that.
No, what I'm saying is you're a company in China, you're a shipping company, you're a bank, and in 2017 you say these are the written sanctions,
Yeah.
and by God, America's really serious about it. They're angry at North Korea. They'll be angry at anybody who violates the sanctions.
Okay, so I can.
And now by late 2018, it's gee whiz, a bromance here going. So has the change in atmosphere between the two leaders changed the seriousness by which companies and countries enforce the sanctions? I've gone over time, so
What I would point to is during these in terms of our investigations, that's what I can speak to. During the Singapore and Hanoi summits and meetings elsewhere, I noticed that these armored Mercedes-Benz that the panel has been investigating for a long time were being driven around the streets of Singapore without, car license plates, driven around the streets of Hanoi. These are serious sanctions violations. I saw Chairman Kim showing off his new Rolls-Royce Phantom to Secretary of State Pompeo when Secretary of State Pompeo was in Pyongyang for negotiations. It's these kind of activities by the North Koreans. And these Mercedes-Benzes are actually important because they were illegally and clandestinely exported from the United States, from New Jersey, from Long Beach, by a Chinese businessman called George Ma, whose company CJet was involved in illegal military equipment deliveries to the Republic of Congo.
I'm going to cut you off there. My colleagues have been very patient.
My apologies.
Well, one of them's been very patient. One of them has left the room. I'm sure his patience will cause him to come back. And my colleagues recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for being here today, sir. I'd like to start by thanking you for acknowledging the sacrifice of your colleagues, Michael and Zaida, and I hope that we'll keep them in mind as we continue our conversations and the incredible work of UN individuals across the world. My question refers to cyber attacks. The UN panel of experts' latest report outlines North Korea's use of cyber attacks against financial institutions and the exploitation of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to illegally access and transfer funds. According to your report, this included cyber attacks not just against small banks or in countries with limited financial infrastructure, but also against commercial and financial entities here in the United States, in South Korea, Europe, and in other key U.S. partners, as well as against the SWIFT messaging system that most of the international banking community relies on to transfer our money from one bank to another. My concerns are twofold. First, how sophisticated are North Korea's offensive cyber attack capabilities, and what more can the U.S., the UN member states, as well do to guard against these types of intrusions? And second, do you see any indications that North Korea might use these cyber attack capabilities to put international banking, the entire system itself, or any of its components at risk?
Yes, I do, and the nearly 5 years I've worked on the panel causes me great concern regarding the security of the international banking system and the level of due diligence and various banks' genuine anti-money laundering capacities. $13.5 million were transferred from the Cosmos Bank via 28 countries in 14,000 simultaneous ATM withdrawals, 10,000 separate transactions over a weekend. So the North Korean hacking of banks is not only sophisticated in terms of how they're breaching banking security software and systems, but they're also organizing small armies of people around the world to withdraw very quickly from ATM machines. This is extremely well organized. Follow the money. With Chairman Kim at every level, if you follow the money, you will be able to address this problem more effectively.
And sir, you mentioned that there were the simultaneous withdrawals coordinated across the world. Do you have an understanding of how it is that they find individuals or find the infrastructure to be able to create that type of offensive engagement of those simultaneous withdrawals?
No, ma'am, I don't, but I think it's a very important area to pursue rapidly, investigating that.
And do you have any indication of whether there might be other actors involved in those sorts of large-scale attacks and where those actors may be coming from? And when I say actors, I mean non-North Korean individuals. Who else might be coordinating on behalf of these efforts?
No, I don't. I will only note that the panel itself has been subject to multiple systemic hacking attempts, and we've put that in our reports.
Excellent. Thank you very much. My second question relates to human rights. According to the UN, 11 million people in North Korea are not getting enough nutritious food, clean drinking water, or access to basic services like health and sanitation. Given the concern over the drop in domestic North Korean food production last year, about 10%, it seems that the humanitarian aid is more important than ever to prevent widespread suffering. My question for you is, how can we balance enforcing UN and U.S. sanctions with a humanitarian imperative to ensure that the people in North Korea do not suffer due to the misguided policies of their government? And do you have any recommendations for ensuring humanitarian assistance actually reaches the North Korean people?
Yes, we do have recommendations for the humanitarian sector, and we've put them in our report to a bit of housekeeping on the UN exemption system, which is now in effect. All I'll say is this, is that the humanitarian agencies, by coming to the Security Council, play the game. They ask for exemptions. The smugglers, they don't, and somehow they are able to import into North Korea very large Rolls-Royce Phantoms in shipping containers. And if they can bring in the Phantoms and the Mercedes in shipping containers, that means they can import the smaller items for the nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Yeah. The humanitarian agencies are playing the game, but I would caution we should be careful with humanitarian discourse on North Korea, because we see what the elite there is prioritizing in terms of imports, and it's not necessarily for the benefit of all these hungry people you're talking about.
Thank you, sir, for your time, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks so much, Mr. Griffiths, for coming in and testifying before us. I wanted to explore a little bit further the humanitarian organizations and the situation there. In January, The Atlantic magazine reported that the State Department would relax certain restrictions on humanitarian assistance to North Korea in response to feedback that such constraints were hindering the delivery of life-saving aid. Would you talk a little bit about what kind of humanitarian assistance is typically provided to the North Korean people? For example, I know that globally North Korea has among the highest rates of tuberculosis, which kills more people than any other infectious disease on the planet. Besides TB relief, would you describe the kind of aid that's typically delivered in North Korea?
Well, I can't really talk about the exemption notices themselves because they are submitted to the committee and confidential. But broadly speaking, where the problems have been is with equipment. Rather than, say, food aid for hungry people, it's because the sanctions are quite comprehensive and the commodity codes are not always in alignment. So you've had problems with things like importing nail clippers, items made of metal, things like that. Yes, TB is a big issue in terms of what the humanitarian agencies want to do, and that's why the panel has recommended the introduction of a so-called white list of goods that would be automatically subject to exemption to help facilitate this process.
Thank you. So the Atlantic also reported that the Trump administration's move to facilitate humanitarian aid, and I'm quoting, does not appear to apply to steps taken last year by the Treasury and Commerce Departments to tighten financial sanctions on North Korea, according to diplomatic sources. Those efforts, which include restrictions on banking transactions, have also impeded deliveries of humanitarian goods. Is further U.S. action needed to ensure that these particular sanctions don't impede humanitarian assistance for the North Korean people? How do you strike that balance?
Well, I think that's more a question for somebody from the member state, in this case, the United States. I really focus on North Korean sanctions evasion, and the policies of individual member states are really where humanitarian aid is concerned. That's their business. It's not for me to say.
Right, well, but you're here representing the panel of experts, right?
Yes,
And
sir,
the
I
panel of experts report made numerous recommendations to remove some of the roadblocks to humanitarian assistance. So I was wondering if you could explain how you came up with those recommendations. Did you consult with humanitarian aid organizations working with North Korea, or, you know, that was really what I was wondering.
Yes, sir, we did. A couple of my colleagues did that.
And so, you know, how would you prioritize what we could do to, you know, reduce those roadblocks without taking the heat off of North Korea, which we don't, you know, very much don't want to do? This is the...
Well, I think if it's possible, the idea of, so it's the UN Security Council 1718 committee that is making the, that is agreeing to these exemptions, and that's somewhere where the delay, sometimes where the delay may occur. So if I was to point to anything at all, it would be perhaps the creation of a whitelist. I'm told such a thing is possible to do. That would give you a simplified list of goods, which could be automatically subject to some form of exemption, thus speeding up the process within the Security Council 1718 committee to clear the items. Our other recommendation was that the UN more generally should look into this problem.
So in other sanctions situations, whitelists have existed, and in this situation, there's no whitelist at all. Is that the situation right now?
Well, most sanctions regimes are not nearly as comprehensive or complex, so it's much easier in terms of an arms embargo to spell out, you know, flak jackets and bulletproof vehicles for civilians, for humanitarian aid use, for example, can be imported into, say, you know, Libya or Yemen, as long as it's much easier in those cases. Here it's more difficult. Within the space of a year, a little more, you've had this absolute block on certain types of machinery being imported, including trucks. All trucks are now prohibited from import to North Korea. Why? Because we've consistently seen the import of trucks for civilian purposes, such as forestry, and then they convert these trucks, these 8-axle vehicles, into ballistic missile launchers. You'll find it in the panel's report. So one does have to be careful of what's imported, and you bring down all these measures, and then there's a consequence because the humanitarian aid agencies, instead of paying bribes or trying to circumvent the measures like the North Koreans do, approach the UN in good faith to go about it the proper way. And that's why my colleagues came up with this whitelist idea after consulting very thoroughly with the humanitarian aid, the UN agencies, and the NGOs, who are trying to do a good job in difficult circumstances.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I'll now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for your diligence. The report states that a member state informed the panel that the Islamic Republic of Iran was one of the 2 most lucrative markets for the DPRK military-related cooperation. What can you tell us about illicit activities between North Korea and Iran, especially trade in arms?
Well, not much more than what we wrote right now. In the past, if you read past panel reports, you'll see that United Nations Security Council designated individuals from COMID, North Korea's principal ballistic missile and conventional military equipment trading and sales company, were based at the North Korean embassy in Tehran. And I wrote Iran many letters about this, 2015, 2016. And after Resolution 2270, where these North Koreans were designated, these North Korean diplomats were designated by the Security Council, Iran eventually expelled them. Unfortunately, what we were told by a member state that provides very reliable information to the panel and often shows us documentation, is that since 2016, both Green Pine, another major North Korean conventional arms military supplier, sells submarines, military patrol boats, small arms, light weapons across the Middle East. Both Green Pine and Comid were back in in Iran, and were providing Iran was providing North Korea with one of its two most lucrative markets, the other being Syria.
I was going to ask you about Syria. What are the most concerning types of defense cooperations and arms trade between North Korea and Syria? Is it small arms? Is it ballistics? Or
in 2017, 2018, it seemed to be ballistic missiles. We'd had reports from member states. We went to visit interdicted goods, container shipments around the Mediterranean that had been stopped from going to Syria. The bills of lading clearly said Syria's the SSRC, Scientific Studies and Research Center, which is responsible for Syria's ballistic missile and chemical weapons development program. And these sites were later bombed by other member states after our report had been submitted.
well, I was going to ask you about that. Has the panel uncovered any evidence indicating North Korean involvement in Syria's chemical weapons program?
We haven't got direct evidence of their involvement in Syria's chemical weapons program, but as we highlight in our reports, there were things like acid-resistant tiles, huge quantities of them, that were intercepted by various member states. We inspected them. These acid-resistant tiles you could build a laboratory from them, or you could use them for a facility for ballistic missiles, because ballistic missile fuel is also highly corrosive. But the level and intensity of North Korean military technicians and ballistic missile technicians and surface-to-air missile technicians visiting Damascus over the past few years, you'll see it in our reports. We list their names, their passport numbers, who they met with, and where they stayed. Okay. And it's interesting reading. It takes me a long time to explain it, but it's all there in black and white.
I believe we're going to read that report and follow through on it. I'm out of questions, Mr. Griffiths. I appreciate your diligence, your service, and look forward to hopefully bringing these sanctions to where they really bring an end to this problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yeah. I'll have a question or two, and then I'll have you make the concluding part of your opening statement. North Korea exports coal. It gets hard currency, but at least the coal doesn't do any extreme damage. Obviously, it's a greenhouse gas producing fossil fuel. But when it exports weapons of mass destruction or relevant technologies, that's a bigger problem. In September 2007, the Israelis bombed Al-Kabar, a nuclear weapons development site in Syria that appears to be almost entirely North Korean technology. What are the examples of North Korea exporting over the last 10 years weapons of mass destruction and relevant and technologies relevant to creations of weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear, but also bio and chemical?
Well, on bio, I have to say that the most recent thing the panel's been looking at is this assassination at Kuala Lumpur Airport.
Yes.
Involving VX and the half-brother of Chairman Kim.
That's well known, and I guess only technically constitutes an export, but the potency of that chemical has been demonstrated. Are they exporting that chemical for cash anywhere around the world?
And we have no knowledge of that, sir. It's not in our reports.
And what about the export of either fissile material or the technology to create fissile material?
We have nothing in our reports on that. What we have is evidence of North Korean procurement of technology for fissile development and evidence of North Korea exporting dual-use goods to other states in the region but nothing relating to a nascent nuclear program. We have no evidence of that, but then the panel doesn't get
So when it
much
comes
information
to
from members.
material useful for creating fissile material, North Korea is an importer but not an exporter,
That's what
as far as we know.
As far as the panel knows, that's correct, sir, yes.
Thank you. Well, at this point, I'd like to hear whatever portions of your opening statement we haven't elicited through questioning.
Well, I'll try not to send you to sleep, and I will keep it short. But the main area is the sea, international waters, where nothing is really being monitored except when there are surveillance aircraft or satellites or other aerial assets in place. And that's because these flag of convenience states, they don't monitor the vessels that sail under their jurisdiction. Many of the petroleum companies that are transferring the product, they don't monitor either. Neither do the insurers, neither do the operators of the vessel, the charterers, the owners. And if you take the time to read the...
If I can interrupt you, what if we provided that if you had insurance for your ship, but you deliberately turned off the AIS, the automatic identification system, the insurance was void?
That sounds like an eminently sensible suggestion.
And another contract provision that we could require being included, obviously only if it was done intentionally for the purpose of evading sanctions. But what that would mean is you pay money for insurance, and then the captain of your ship turns this off, and there's some evidence that it's to evade sanctions, and you happen to be located only a few hundred miles off the shores of North Korea. Now you don't have insurance. If you're going to, that's another thing that we would want to explore. Why don't you continue?
Yes, and the other issue is that North Korea is really systemically violating the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea and IMO regulations. And neither the IMO regulations, the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, or the UNCLOS were ever devised with this kind of situation in mind, where vessels could be hijacked and then provided with the North Korean flag and safe harbor, and just operate between North Korea and international waters to transfer fuel. So North Korean ships often carry North Korean papers, but also Sierra Leone or another flag of convenience papers. You see this in the case of the Wise Honest. It's a very interesting case in our report, where a North Korean ship delivering coal sails to Indonesia with its AIS switched off. Coal is worth $3 million according to the contract. The idea is to transship it, call it Russian coal or something, and then sell it to a company in South Korea.
So the coal has to be transported all the way to Indonesia and then comes back to South Korea?
Yes, sir.
Labeled Russian coal. And dead giveaway in this is if you have a ship transporting, quote, Russian coal to South Korea from Indonesia, well, I guess if that was shipped out of European Russia, that would make sense. But if it's shipped out of the Russian Pacific, and I don't know where this coal is purportedly coming from, the fact that it's coming from Indonesia shows that something's fishy. Do you know, I mean, when they purport that this is Russian coal, are they basically claiming that this is coal being shipped out of Russian ports on the Atlantic or on the Pacific?
So there was no documentation provided to us. What we can tell you, and it's worth noting, is that the whole deal was organized facilitated by North Korean diplomats in Indonesia, and there are these North Korean bankers who are traveling around Indonesia, Vietnam, and China, trying to facilitate these deals in a clandestine fashion by providing false paperwork. The Wise Honest is currently seized and is in Indonesian waters right now. But somewhat shockingly, if you look in the panel's final report in the annexes, you'll see that a US bank was, I'm sure, unwittingly involved in the payment system. And it happens to be the bank I use in New York. So it's a very good case study. The Wise Honest, it's a fantastic name for a vessel involved in prohibited and illegal activities. But you'll really get a sense of how the North Koreans are doing this and the relatively simple measures that could be taken to stop them earning this illegal income.
I'm going to ask for a whole annex of, because I know you haven't created a wish list, but what clause, and we can get lawyers to fine tune this stuff, but what clause there should be in maritime insurance, what clause there should be in bank financing of ships, what else we can require of substantial companies that usually do business in the United States include in their documents. I know I interrupted you. I don't know if you have a further portion of your concluding statement.
Why is this problem with the law of the sea important? Why is it necessary to monitor vessels? Because it's not happening in so many different regions, and it's not just about North Korean sanctions. This is about narcotics trafficking. The same flags of convenience are used. Illegal and undocumented fishing. Also, transnational criminal groups use such vessels, which aren't being monitored by the flag states, to sail all these poor economic migrants from African and Middle Eastern shores to Europe and other places. And these vessels are typically unsafe as well. So it's a global issue, and I think it's high time that there's more maritime governance on the high seas. Otherwise, Chairman Kim is going to have room for maneuver for some time to come, and it's just very important to follow the money. And maritime transport is what makes a lot of it possible right now, that and the cyber issues.
Well, I want to thank you for delivering both an opening and closing statement, and more importantly, answers to all of the subcommittee's questions. Thank you for your report, and thank you for reminding us of the perils and difficulties that UN observers and investigators face around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.